Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we sift through the sources you trust, extract the most crucial knowledge, and really turn complex research into unforgettable insights.
And today, we are taking on a huge one.
A massive one. A politician whose shadow spanned 16 years and really fundamentally redefined not just Germany, but all of Europe. Angela Merkel.
When you just look at the raw numbers, Chancellor of Germany from 2005 to 2021, the sheer length of time is just breathtaking.
It really is.
But the truly exceptional part, the thing that makes her story so unique, is that she's the only woman and the only person who grew up in the former communist East Germany to ever hold that office.
Right.
We're talking about someone who went from studying quantum chemistry in a lab to being called, the de facto leader of the European Union.
And that transition right there, scientist to global political figure, that's where the core duality of her story is, isn't it? She was this methodical, data-driven pragmatist, the ultimate crisis manager. But then she also became the face of this profoundly moral humanitarian policy during the 2015 migrant crisis.
Right.
Rallying the country with that incredibly famous and emotionally charged phrase, "Wir schaffen das," we can do this.
And our mission today is to synthesize the massive and often contradictory story that's in the sources you showed. We need to figure out how her East German upbringing, her scientific roots, how that created her unique decision-making style, and then how she used the chaos of reunification for this incredibly rapid political ascent, and then really dig into her 4 terms, which were basically just 4 back-to-back global crises.
The Eurozone collapse, the refugee crisis, COVID.
Exactly. And we also have to grapple with the scrutiny that's now being applied to her legacy, especially when it comes to these critical errors in foreign policy with Russia.
So let's unpack this. Our roadmap, it starts with her highly improbable formative years in East Germany, her academic training, which really, it seems, provided the engine for her political logic.
Yeah.
Then we'll track her almost accidental entry into politics and her, frankly, ruthless rise through the CDU under Helmut Kohl. We'll spend a lot of time on her defining crisis management years, and finally we'll grapple with her enduring, complex, and increasingly criticized legacy.
Let's do it.
Okay, so this is where Angela Merkel's story takes an immediate, highly unconventional turn. It almost feels counterintuitive to everything we know about the Cold War. She was born Angela Dorothea Kasner in Hamburg, West Germany in 1954.
Right, in the West.
But just a few months later, her family moved east, into the Communist German Democratic Republic, the GDR.
Yeah.
I mean, why on earth would anyone choose to move from the free West to the heavily restricted East in 1954?
It was a very deliberate choice, and it was rooted in faith. Her father, Horst Kasner, was a Lutheran pastor, and in 1954 he accepted a post in Quitzow, which is about 90 kilometers north of East Berlin.
So he saw it as a calling.
Exactly. The sources point out that in the post-war period, there was a real shortage of committed church workers in the East, and her father felt a calling to serve that community, under the challenging rules of the communist regime.
So right away, her family is in this sort of paradoxical space. They're living under a communist government, but at the same time, they're operating inside the protective, parallel moral universe of the church.
That dual existence is absolutely crucial to understanding her.
I can imagine.
It's fundamental. They were citizens who had to obey the state, but their core identity, their morality, that came from an institution the state tolerated but didn't really control. And this fosters an environment of necessary political pragmatism, a measured distance from ideology.
Okay, so let's talk about her youth in the GDR. The sources, they all agree. She wasn't just bright. She was academically brilliant.
A true intellectual powerhouse. She finished school with the best possible average grade, a 1.0. For listeners who aren't familiar with the German system, the Abitur is the final high school exam, and a 1.0 is basically a perfect score.
Wow.
She also won prizes for her skill in Russian, which was the mandatory foreign language, and in mathematics. She was exactly the kind of high-achieving student the state wanted to, cultivate and promote.
And to stay on that track, she joined the communist youth movement, the Free German Youth, or FGJ. But we need to add some context here, right? This wasn't necessarily some big ideological choice.
That's vital context, yeah. While FDJ membership was technically voluntary, the sources remind us it was essentially a prerequisite for getting into a university and having an academic career.
So it was a means to an end.
For a pragmatic young woman focused on doing her best within the system's boundaries, joining was just a necessary step for advancement.
And yet, at the same time, she made this quiet but very clear gesture of nonconformity. She chose to be confirmed in the church instead of doing the common state-sanctioned coming-of-age ritual.
The Jugendweihe. That ritual was basically the state's secular rival to Christian confirmation. It was designed to indoctrinate young people into socialist principles.
Right.
So by opting for confirmation, she kept the family's moral and religious separation from the state's core ideology. It's a really early example of her political style. Follow the mandatory rules, like FDJ membership, but quietly and strategically resist where it conflicts with your core values.
There's that incredibly telling quote from her about growing up there. She said, "Life in the GDR was sometimes almost comfortable because there were some things one simply couldn't influence."
It says so much, doesn't it? It speaks to a system that eliminates choice, which lets you just focus on optimizing within these fixed parameters.
The scientist's mindset.
Exactly. If the political boundaries are fixed, the variables are set, you just focus on problem solving within those constraints. And that led her straight to a path that valued objective, empirical data science.
Right. Physics.
She studied physics from 1973 to 78 at Karl Marx University in Leipzig, and then spent 12 years working and studying at the Central Institute for Physical Chemistry in Berlin.
And this was not a soft intellectual environment. This was serious, hardcore science.
Oh, yeah. She earned her doctorate, Dr. Veronat, which is like a PhD in natural sciences and quantum chemistry in 1986. Her work was intensely focused on chemical reaction mechanisms.
What does that mean in layman's terms?
She was looking at complex systems, identifying decay reactions, and calculating the mathematical rate constants of those reactions. This intellectual foundation demands meticulous, evidence-based problem solving. It rejects abstract dogma. It demands data. And that is the engine that later drove her political responses.
Okay, so let's pull out the anecdote that perfectly shows that blend of moral clarity and calculating shrewdness. She was offered an assistant professorship, but it came with a dark condition related to the Stasi.
Indeed. The Stasi, East Germany's notorious secret police, they required her to agree to be an informal coworker, basically to spy on her colleagues.
Terrifying.
She needed a way to refuse the offer without, facing official punishment or derailing her career entirely.
And what was her excuse for declining?
She claimed, with this sort of self-deprecating wit, that she was unsuitable for the job because she could not keep secrets well enough to be an effective spy.
That's brilliant.
Think about it. In a system built on paranoia and surveillance, she managed to refuse a moral compromise by framing her own integrity as a lack of competence.
A harmless character flaw.
Exactly. That refusal, it shows a mastery of political risk management that you just don't expect from a typical lab scientist.
It's an incredibly quick-witted move. And when you look back at the connection between quantum chemistry and her political style, it's not just that she likes facts. It's about how she approaches these complex systemic problems.
It's about methodology. In chemistry, if you have a system that starts to decay, you don't panic. You analyze the inputs, you identify the rate constants, and you calculate the least destructive path forward. In politics, Merkel translated this into her methodical approach, relying on expert analysis, demanding data, and resisting grand, emotional political rhetoric. When the euro was decaying or when a pandemic hit, she didn't jump to ideological solutions. She acted like the lab manager, calculating the least worst outcome based on the available data.
So the lab coat was about to be swapped for a blazer.
Everything changed in November 1989 with the sudden, almost miraculous fall of the Berlin Wall. She was suddenly catapulted from the obscurity of a research institute into the blinding light of the public sphere.
Her political acceleration was just breathtaking.
It was. She immediately gravitated toward the new democratic movement, joining a group called Democratic Awakening, or DA. And she moved fast, using her composure and communication skills to become the party's press spokeswoman in February 1990.
And that role immediately became a trial by fire, didn't it? Especially when the party leader, Wolfgang Schnurr, was exposed as having been a collaborator with the Stasi.
Yes. The scandal hit almost as soon as she took the job, and the sources note that the calm, effective, and pragmatic way she handled the intense media scrutiny around Schnurr's betrayal is what caught the eye of Lothar de Maizière, who led the last government of the GDR before reunification.
He was impressed by her composure under crisis.
Very impressed. But, some sources also suggest she was just lucky. She was the clean face available after the scandal, a relative unknown with no Stasi baggage from a pastor's family.
So how much was pure timing and how much was merit?
It was a perfect storm of merit meeting opportunity. Her calm handling of the crisis was the merit, Being an Aussie and East German with no political history, that was the perfect timing. As the DA merged into the much larger Christian Democratic Union, the CDU of West Germany, Merkel was already positioned as a high-visibility figure. She went from a tiny opposition group to a major ruling party in a matter of months.
And now we get into the famous Kohl protégé era from 1990 to 98 under the Chancellor of Reunification himself, Helmut Kohl. He brought her into the Bundestag and appointed her Minister for Women and Youth in 1991.
And he gave her that famous, slightly patronizing nickname, my girl, mein Mädchen.
A bit condescending by today's standards.
But incredibly condescending. But Kohl's patronage was the necessary launch pad. He needed a fresh face, particularly an East German Protestant woman, to symbolize the success of reunification.
So what were her key policy achievements or moves in this first ministerial role?
Well, as Minister for Women and Youth, she was instrumental in codifying the right to preschool education. More tellingly, though, when the controversial debate over abortion rights came to a vote, a hugely divisive issue that split her party, she abstained.
Interesting.
This is another early sign of her preferred strategy. If a political conflict is unnecessary for the immediate goal, she avoids it, minimizing internal damage. She was personally opposed to abortion, but politically she refused to plant a flag in the middle of a war zone she didn't need to win.
Then she gets a big promotion in 1994, becoming Minister for the Environment and Nuclear Safety. This gives her her first real global platform.
That's when she really started building international credibility. She's specifically credited with organizing and setting up the critical United Nations 1995 Berlin Climate Change Conference.
That was a huge deal.
Huge, because it achieved the first international commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So Merkel might have been Kohl's junior minister, but she was negotiating multilateral agreements on the world stage, showing an early ability to manage these high-stakes, complex, cross-border issues.
The narrative shifts abruptly after the CDU loses the 1998 election.
Yeah.
Kohl is out. She goes from minister to general secretary of the party. But this is the moment she cuts the cord, right? She stops being my girl.
This is the critical juncture, the moment of political calculated decay reaction. After the election loss, the party was consumed by a devastating party funding scandal that implicated both Kohl and his designated successor, Wolfgang Schäuble.
The entire old guard was compromised.
Morally and legally, yes. And what did Merkel do? She made an audacious, ruthlessly effective move.
The op-ed.
The op-ed. She published a piece in a major newspaper, publicly criticizing her former mentor, Kohl, and the old guard. She advocated for a fresh start for the party. A start, implicitly, without them.
That is cold.
It was shocking for its cold calculation. She leveraged the vulnerability of the very people who had propelled her career to seize power herself. She just stepped right into the vacuum of moral authority.
And it worked. In 2000, she was elected CDU chairperson. This was a massive political barrier to break, not just for gender, but for culture.
She was the party's first female leader, and she did something that seemed impossible. She was a centrist Protestant from the North, leading a traditionally male-dominated party that was rooted deeply in conservative Catholic tradition in the South and West.
So it wasn't just a win, it was a total recalibration of the party's identity.
Driven by practical necessity and political opportunity.
But she didn't become chancellor right away. There was the famous 2002 Wolfratshausen breakfast negotiation. Tell us why giving up the chancellorship bid was actually a brilliant long-term move.
In the run-up to 2002, she knew that while she led the party, the more popular candidate with the influential conservative wing was the CSU leader, Edmund Stoiber.
Right.
She could have fought him and lost, which would have diminished her standing. Instead, in that private negotiation, she conceded the candidacy to Stoiber, and the genius trade-off was vital. In exchange for stepping aside, she secured her position as the leader of the opposition, regardless of the election outcome.
Which was smart, because Stoiber narrowly lost to Gerhard Schröder. So Merkel immediately steps into the leader of the opposition role, sidelining her internal rival Friedrich Merz.
Classic Merkel long-game strategy. She secured guaranteed power by strategically avoiding the central contest.
And what did she do in opposition?
She spent her time championing controversial structural reforms, pro-market policies, changes to German labor laws, arguing that existing regulations made Germany less competitive. She was building her credentials as an economic reformer.
We should also point out her very controversial foreign policy stance on the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. This really defined her commitment to the transatlantic alliance.
Absolutely. While Chancellor Schröder explicitly opposed the U.S. involvement, aligning Germany with France, Merkel openly took the opposite view. She flew to Washington and published an op-ed supporting the invasion, calling it unavoidable.
Wow. That must have been unpopular at home.
It directly defied strong public opinion in Germany and the sitting government, but it underscored a core tenet of her future foreign policy, prioritizing the German-American friendship and the transatlantic partnership, even at the cost of domestic political capital.
Okay, so we arrive at the 2005 election. Despite her tactical brilliance in getting the party leadership, her actual campaign to unseat Schröder was, well, it was initially full of errors.
Yeah. It was incredibly bumpy. The CDU-CSU started with a huge lead, but Merkel's personal popularity lagged. She tried to make economic competence central, but famously confused gross and net income twice in a televised debate.
Ouch.
And then her proposal for a flat tax system and increasing the national VAT rate drew this immediate, furious public backlash. The SPD's simple counterpromise not to increase taxes just hammered the CDU's lead.
So the result was an election night stalemate.
Pretty much. The CDU-CSU won 35.2%. The SPD won 34.2%. Neither traditional coalition had a majority, forcing the two biggest rivals to form the first CDU-SPD Grand Coalition.
And after weeks of negotiation, Merkel becomes chancellor.
Yes, and that government was immediately forced to implement painful compromises, like cutting public spending while also raising the VAT from 16% to 19%.
And her first term was almost immediately consumed by global economic turmoil. Right. The 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent, much more severe Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. This is where the methodical, scientific mindset becomes her greatest political asset.
Well, the initial reaction to the banking collapse showed the chaos. When Ireland guaranteed all private deposits, Merkel initially criticized the move, saying Germany would not follow suit.
And then?
But within 48 hours, she reversed course, appearing before the press to announce the German government would guarantee all private savings. The sources note this was a swift political maneuver, a necessary reassurance to calm the public, even though the legislative backing wasn't even secured yet.
And when a major institution was about to fail, the government's response was massive and rapid.
Yes. They acted decisively to prevent the collapse of the mortgage lender Hypo Real Estate, requiring contributions from German banks and a staggering €20 billion emergency credit line from the Bundesbank.
So they were willing to use massive state power to prevent systemic collapse.
No question.
Now here is a key domestic policy success from that time, one that rarely made international headlines, but arguably defined Germany's resilience during the recession: the Kurzarbeit program.
This is a perfect example of Merkel's pragmatic, anti-ideological response. Kurzarbeit, or short-time work, is a provision where, instead of laying off workers when demand drops, the government steps in to subsidize the difference between the workers' current, reduced salaries and their previous full-time earnings.
So it's a life raft for the German workforce.
It really is. The Merkel cabinet significantly expanded this program, extending the subsidy contract length. The insight was that maintaining the connection between the company and the worker stabilizes consumer demand and prevents unemployment from becoming structural.
And the impact.
Kurzarbeit is widely credited with saving an estimated 500,000 jobs during the 2008 financial crisis. While other countries faced skyrocketing unemployment, Germany buffered the shock by temporarily putting its workforce on standby, ready to restart when demand returned.
A methodical stabilization technique.
Like calculating the exact force needed to stabilize a decay reaction, it was pure Merkel.
Shifting to Europe, she became the undisputed leader of the response to the Eurozone crisis. She's credited with helping save the euro.
That credit is certainly due, but the legacy is deeply double-edged. As the largest creditor nation, Germany under Merkel insisted on harsh austerity measures for debtor nations like Greece, Spain, and Portugal.
And this is where her domestic fiscal prudence clashed severely with continental political stability. Why did critics find these measures so harmful?
Critics argued that Merkel's demands were too severe and poorly timed. The austerity required massive cuts to public sector jobs, slashing pensions, and reducing government services precisely when those economies were already contracting.
So it just deepened the depression.
That's the argument, that it resulted in a lost decade of growth for Southern Europe. Opposition figures even accused her government of financial blackmail during the climactic 2015 Greek negotiations.
And there was the critique that Germany ignored the role of its own financial sector in enabling the crisis.
Yeah. Exactly. German banks were among the largest lenders to countries like Greece and Ireland. Critics argued that, irresponsible borrowers can't exist without irresponsible lenders. By insisting only on reforms from the debtors and protecting German banking interests, Merkel's policy was accused of fueling anti-German and anti-EU sentiment across the continent.
Okay, moving into her second term, 2009 to 2013, with a new coalition, we see two massive domestic changes. First, abolishing conscription.
The decision to abolish compulsory military service was finalized in 2011. The rationale was budget savings and modernization. However, this had become a major retrospective critique.
Right, since the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Public opinion has shifted dramatically. By 2023, 61% of Germans favored reestablishing conscription. It's a classic example of prioritizing short-term budget needs over long-term strategic resilience.
The second major shift was the Energiewende, the massive energy transition plan spurred by the Fukushima disaster.
The Fukushima disaster in 2011 fundamentally altered German energy policy. Despite earlier plans to extend the life of nuclear plants, Merkel's government suddenly reversed course, accelerating the phase-out of all nuclear power, which just concluded in 2023.
So a massive pivot to renewables.
A hugely expensive, defining decision. It satisfied a long-held political desire for environmental protection, but it created an immediate, urgent gap in stable baseload power.
And finally, during this era, the foundation was being laid for what would become her most scrutinized foreign policy failure, the dependence on Russia.
Despite the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the sanctions that followed, Merkel spent this period strengthening Eurasian economic ties. Her administration protected and initiated the controversial Nord Stream 2 pipelines.
This was the Wandel durch Handel philosophy, change through trade.
Her deep-seated belief in it, yes, the idea that economic integration would inevitably lead to political normalization with autocratic regimes. It was a massive strategic gamble, prioritizing economic stability and cheap energy over geopolitical foresight.
Her 2013 election victory was extraordinary. The CDU-CSU achieved one of its best results since reunification. Her personal approval rating was at 77%. She seemed unassailable.
But the second half of her chancellorship would be defined by crises that tested her moral fiber more than her fiscal prudence.
The 2015 European migrant crisis.
The ultimate test. It redefined her from a pragmatic technician to a figure making a profound moral stand. The moment came in late August 2015 when the government effectively suspended the Dublin regulation for Syrian refugees,
which allowed them to claim asylum in Germany, even if they'd entered the EU through other safe countries first.
A monumental decision, culminating in the phrase that will define her historical legacy, "Wir schaffen das." We can do this.
And the result was an unprecedented influx.
Nearly 1.1 million asylum seekers arrived in 2015. And while the move won her immense international praise for courage and compassion, it drew immediate and fierce domestic and political opposition.
Particularly from her own conservative bloc, led by CSU leader Horst Seehofer. What was their main criticism?
Seehofer slammed her policy, claiming the situation was without rules, without system, and without order. The political argument focused on security and capacity. He publicly claimed that as many as 30% of asylum seekers claiming to be Syrian were actually from other countries.
An attempt to discredit the humanitarian nature of the policy.
And force a numerical cap. She had to navigate that impossible tension. After the Paris terrorist attacks, there was a necessary reevaluation. And while she resisted setting a definitive cap, she did tighten asylum policy significantly.
How so?
Through measures like more thorough vetting for security purposes and restricting family reunification for 2 years. It was a gradual tightening, showing her ability to maintain a position while adapting to political pressure.
But the political impact of this crisis was seismic and permanent. It directly fueled the rise of the far-right alternative for Germany, the AfD.
Their surge in the 2017 election, where they got 12% of the vote, fundamentally fractured the German party system. Researchers directly link this surge to the refugee crisis. Merkel's singular decision, born of moral conviction, permanently changed German political alignment,
which made forming a stable government much harder.
Immediately evident after the 2017 election, negotiations lasted almost 6 months before the Third Grand Coalition was finally formed.
And that tension triggered the 2018 government crisis.
Interior Minister Horst Seehofer, still demanding a harder line, threatened to unilaterally reject migrants who had already been registered elsewhere in the EU. He was effectively acting against Merkel's expressed European policy.
So she had to choose between the stability of her government and the stability of the entire EU structure.
Precisely the dilemma. She feared that unilateral action by Germany would trigger a domino effect, undermining the EU and endangering the Schengen area. She flew to Brussels, got a Europe-wide agreement, but Seehofer rejected even that and threatened to resign.
But they reached a compromise.
A last-minute internal compromise on tighter border control. Merkel survived, but the episode showed the severe fragility of her power base. It forced her to announce later that year that she would step down as CDU leader, though she would finish her term as chancellor.
And as she wrestled with these divisions, she faced one final, unexpected challenge that played directly to her scientific strengths: the COVID-19 pandemic.
Her leadership during the initial phases was widely praised for its clarity and reliance on expert advice. She led the response with a scientific rigor few other global leaders could match.
I remember her explanation of the R number.
It was famous. She provided a calm, accessible explanation of the basic reproduction number in a public address, immediately translating complex epidemiology into public health policy.
Her communication during this time was highly effective, culminating in a powerful address in March 2020.
A monumental speech. She compared the severity of the challenge to the Second World War. She stressed that since the Second World War, there has not been a challenge for our country in which action in a spirit of solidarity on our part was so important.
And she used it to champion EU solidarity.
Calling the pandemic the biggest test since the EU's foundation, she successfully spearheaded the negotiations for the massive next-generation EU reconstruction package.
The final chapter was her succession. And after announcing in 2018 she wouldn't seek a fifth term, the transition became highly volatile.
It was messy. It exposed her diminished control over the party. Her chosen protégé, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, resigned as party leader after a scandal in Thuringia where local CDU members defied party lines and voted with the AfD.
It showed the party's internal discipline was crumbling.
Exactly. She left office in December 2021, succeeded by Olaf Scholz. Poignantly, her own constituency, which she had held since reunification, was actually won by an SPD candidate.
And almost immediately after she stepped down, her tenure faced its most severe retrospective challenge: the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine.
She condemned the war immediately as a profound break in the history of post-Cold War Europe. But her past decisions regarding Russia and defense were immediately scrutinized.
She defended her contentious 2008 decision to block Ukraine's NATO accession, didn't she?
She did. She argued that had Ukraine joined then, Russia would have launched the war earlier, potentially placing Ukraine at a greater disadvantage. It's a defense that highlights her career-long focus on deferring conflict and maintaining status quo stability, even when that status quo was strategically precarious.
So when we synthesize her 16 years, her political philosophy is so hard to label. She masterfully occupied the political center by adopting positions from both the left and the right. It's full of deep contradictions.
The contradictions are central to her long-term success. Take immigration and integration policy. In 2010, she declared that attempts to build a multicultural society in Germany had utterly failed.
She sounded like a hardline conservative.
Insisting immigrants must adopt German culture and values. But just 5 years later, at the height of the refugee crisis, she offered this profound statement of inclusion, declaring, "Islam is part of Germany."
So which was it?
That's the Merkel maneuver. She was capable of speaking the language of hard conservatism when necessary to maintain political balance, yet could deliver a defining humanitarian principle when history demanded it. By balancing these contradictory principles, she effectively denied political oxygen to her rivals and just owned the political center ground for nearly 2 decades.
Her fiscal policy was another defining pillar, summarized by those 3 famous statistics she used to define Europe's economic challenge.
She hammered this point repeatedly. She argued that Europe had 7% of the global population, produced 25% of the global GDP, but accounted for nearly 50% of global social expenditure.
Right, her argument for fiscal consolidation.
She insisted that Europe could only sustain its social model by radically increasing competitiveness. Her commitment to a balanced budget was so strong that she rejected new investment calls in infrastructure as late as 2019, believing prudence was always the highest priority.
Her climate policy legacy is similarly complicated. She was the initial climate chancellor, but then faced increasing criticism later on for lack of domestic action.
She was instrumental in the 1995 Berlin climate commitments. But by the mid-2010s, critics argued domestic action lagged severely. Even her €54 billion climate package in 2019 was widely condemned by scientists and activists.
They called it insufficient and a failure of the political system.
And while she achieved the enormous feat of transitioning Germany away from nuclear power, she struggled significantly to fully decarbonize the economy quickly enough, largely due to the continued reliance on coal.
Okay, let's pivot to the major criticisms that truly stick to her legacy. First, the political language she used sometimes drew accusations of being profoundly undemocratic, particularly during the Eurozone crisis.
That is perfectly encapsulated by the term alternativless German for without an alternative, which she frequently used to describe her necessary austerity and bailout measures.
The unword of the year 2010.
Yes. Linguistic scholars criticized it as an undemocratic rhetorical device that shut down legitimate political discussion. It suggests that her methodical, data-driven approach, while effective, had an inherent intellectual arrogance that dismissed political debate.
And there's a great irony there, too.
A huge one. The term alternative los became so potent that it's ironically credited as the inspiration for the name of the anti-establishment party that rose in response to her crisis management. The Alternative for Germany, the AfD.
Their name is a direct rejection of her closing of debate.
Exactly.
She also faced significant international criticism for her foreign policy regarding China.
Critics accused her of failing to take a tough line on the People's Republic of China, consistently prioritizing commercial ties over human rights or geopolitical alignment. Her policy was entirely associated with Wandel durch Handel.
Change to trade.
And the sources note her diplomacy focused heavily on non-interference in Beijing's internal affairs, all to secure German industry access to Chinese markets.
But the most immediate and defining scrutiny following her departure centers entirely on Russia. The 2022 invasion forced an instant, critical reevaluation of her strategy.
The numbers are stark proof of the strategic vulnerability she fostered. By late 2021, Germany relied on Russia for 55% of its gas, 34% of its oil, and 52% of its coal.
That's staggering.
Critics argue vehemently that her policy of maintaining good relations and doubling down on pipelines like Nord Stream 2, even after the annexation of Crimea, constituted a catastrophic strategic failure. Politico went so far as to argue that no German politician was more responsible for the crisis in Ukraine than Merkel.
And this dependence was coupled with another strategic error: the systematic downsizing and neglect of the German military, the Bundeswehr.
That is the second pillar of the criticism. The abolition of conscription, the failure to meet NATO financial commitments, combined with the energy dependence on Russia, led critics to argue that her relentless pursuit of economic normalization and stability had severely weakened the defensive position of Germany in Europe right before the crisis hit.
We must also return to the Eurozone crisis because the austerity critique is such a huge part of her international legacy.
Her insistence on fiscal consolidation and austerity is now blamed for fueling anti-EU sentiment and the rise of radical parties across the continent. Academics argue that the crisis and the subsequent German-imposed austerity policies contributed significantly to the climate that enabled Brexit in the UK.
So solving one crisis created another.
The argument is that her domestic-focused, pragmatic crisis management in one area, saving the euro based on German fiscal models, created major, unintended systemic political crises in other parts of Europe by strengthening Euroscepticism.
Finally, let's look at her international image versus her domestic one. Globally, she was often seen as the last stable bastion of liberal democracy.
Her international stature was unparalleled. Forbes named her the world's second most powerful person multiple times. In 2015, Time magazine named her Person of the Year, dubbing her the Chancellor of the Free World.
After Trump's election, she was called the liberal West's last defender.
Repeatedly recognized as the most widely respected world leader in global surveys.
And she was often compared to Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady.
The Iron Frau comparison was inevitable, given the conservative politics, the science background, the longevity. But the comparison falls short on one crucial point. Al Jazeera noted that Merkel lacked Thatcher's my way or the highway confrontational attitude.
Right. Merkel was a consensus builder.
She maneuvered politically around obstacles rather than blasting through them. Domestically, she settled into the much more affectionate nickname Mutti, or Mother, which speaks to a stable, reliable figure overseeing the nation, creating a generation of voters, the Merkelkinder, who only knew her stability.
Looking back, it's truly a remarkable arc. From a young scientist in communist East Germany analyzing decay reactions in a lab, to spending 16 years applying that same methodical process to political decay reactions on the European stage.
Her enduring impact is rooted entirely in her mastery of crisis management, always emphasizing pragmatism, technical solutions, and incremental steps forward. She was the master of short-term stability.
Not.
But this leads us to the crucial final evaluation. Did that relentless focus on stabilizing the immediate crisis, whether pushing harsh austerity to calm markets or relying on cheap Russian energy to fuel Germany's industry, did that inadvertently set up greater, unforeseen systemic crises for her successors?
Was the price of avoiding ideological confrontation today simply a guarantee of strategic vulnerability tomorrow?
That's the ultimate question we are left with.
We've seen that Angela Merkel often navigated complexity by prioritizing practicality and minimizing political turbulence where she could. If the central theme of her career was, how do we manage this immediate problem? Or, what does the data tell us is the least destructive path? Quote, what larger foundational questions must future leaders ask that Merkel's style of pragmatic crisis management may have intentionally deferred? We leave you with the question, what is the true long-term price of political stability?